Is a recording for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, and anybody else, as usual, who would like to listen and chip in with a few ideas. The February meeting will be discussing the works of Marie-Louise von Franz, who, for anybody listening who is unfamiliar with her, she was a student, in fact, one of the central students that followed Carl Jung, a very accomplished linguist. She helped translate many of his works and translated the works that he relied upon, the Greek and Latin and so on texts that he was studying and looking at. So she was not just a pupil, she was sort of one of the leading lights of the post-Jungian movement. We discussed last month briefly in our group chat whether or not to go into the biographical side of her life or focus primarily on her ideas, and the decision was reached that it would be better to focus on her ideas than spend too much time going into the ins and outs of her personal life. Although there are elements which do kind of impact. So, for example, she had a very unhappy relationship with her own mother, and after enrolling with Jung and studying with him for some years, he recommended that she move into a house share or flat share, whatever you'd call it, with another Jungian, much older woman, old enough to be her mother, so that she could have the experience of a positive relationship with an older woman rather than just the sort of hostile relationship she had with her own mother. And it worked so well that they became friends for life. And so a kind of applied therapy came in there in a very informal way, not an official form of therapy, but just a practical step she could take to address some of her own childhood traumas. And I think also it shapes and influences a lot of her writing, which dealt with the feminine side of the psyche. She felt, as do many others, that Jung was quite heavily focused on the masculine side of the psyche, perhaps unintentionally writing more from, what he would do, wouldn't he, being a man, write more from a male point of view, without fully realising that he had not addressed a lot of issues for women. And so that's something that Marie-Louise von Franz brought in, was an understanding of the experiences of women, the heroine's journey as well as the hero's journey that Campbell talks about in his writings. So it shifted the focus somewhat. So kind of a little bit of biographical detail is maybe useful, but not too much. So one of the contributions she made, one of the ideas, and obviously over the course of a lifetime we're talking a lot of ideas, so I'm just going to give a very reduced snapshot of some of her key ideas that I think would be interesting to talk about. But if you are intending to take part in the discussion group at the end of February and you want to talk about some of her other ideas, the ones that I don't mention in this recording, then obviously by all means do so. More the merrier in terms of flagging up different concepts and different notions. So one of the things that she wrote about was the importance of fairy tales. Jung was, like Freud, very focused on mythology and the sort of big grand stories of gods and giants and dragons and sort of huge things. Fairy tales tend to deal with, although you obviously get giants and dragons in fairy tales, but they tend to deal with more small scale issues. The lives of more ordinary people, rather than those who are sort of half god, half human and so on, which is more the remit of mythology, obviously. And she makes the argument that fairy tales are terrifically important, laying the groundwork for ideas that people like Bettelheim and numerous others would build on later, and that they often deal with key issues to give insight into ordinary human experiences and the human condition. And they do so, she suggests, in a way that half a dozen different fairy tales may deal with the same issue but from slightly different angles. And so understanding the half dozen different fairy tales will give you a more enriched perspective, an insight into the archetypal issues that the fairy tales deal with. So well, obviously you've got to start somewhere, so you have to start with a fairy tale, but the idea would be to not leave it there, but to go on and look at other fairy tales that deal with similar themes, And obviously, the body of fairy tales that have been produced over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years is vast. So there's many issues dealt with, and some of it, as she herself notes, includes sort of cultural perspectives. So a French fairy tale might address issues differently from, say, a German fairy tale or a Dutch fairy tale or a Chinese fairy tale. They're coming at it from different angles, different understandings, which reflect the cultural values of the people, the culture amongst which that fairy tale has emerged. So there's a lot of that going on. And one thing she also suggests in terms of the fairy tale can be understood is that they deal with collective issues. So when Jung is writing about archetypes and mythology, he's suggesting these are stories that give insight into individuation, how one person can face the challenges in their life, develop their psyche, achieve decades down the line this state of integration, of individuation, of becoming a very rounded person. Whereas what von Franz is suggesting about fairy tales is they're not so much about individual humans and individual experiences and individuation. Rather, they're looking at issues that affect the collective. What impacts on our tribe, our nation, our cultural grouping? What are the issues we face? How do we, in the shared sense, address these concepts? So, whilst I'm sure there are insights to be had for the individual person, it's more useful from her stance to think about these stories as giving insights into a collective, into a culture, so that multiple people within those cultures will go through these kinds of experiences. So all of the characters, the goodies and the baddies and the helpful talking animals and all the various other things that crop up in a given fairy tale are aspects of a culture rather than aspects of an individual psyche, which is Jung's argument about mythology. So that they're understood in a slightly bigger way, which is at one level ironic. Fairy tales dealing with small things but big groups, myths, these grandiose stories of myths dealing with the individual. But perhaps that's the kind of almost Taoist kind of counterpointing that with the yin and the yang, you get the seed of one in the other. So the small contains the big contains the small, in a sense. And I think maybe we could, for our end of the month discussion, think of a couple of fairy tales, see whatever people would like to talk about, and perhaps go with fairy tales from our own cultural background rather than other parts of the world, and think, what do these fairy tales tell us about our cultural heritage, our collective heritage, the way we deal with things? Can these characters in the fairy tales, Jack and the Beanstalk or whatever it might be, can they be understood as reflecting different institutions, different practices, different cultural attitudes and outlooks within the culture with which we are familiar, and kind of run with it from there and apply it in that way? She suggests the hero characters, like Jack in Jack and the Beanstalk, or she uses the German term Dummling. In English fairy tales, it's often the simple brother, the simple-minded one of the three, or the simple sister occasionally, but there's usually three brothers, three sisters, and the youngest one is also regarded as the daftest, doziest one. That's in German the Dummling, the one who is seen as a bit thick. They are the one who resolves the problems. So the hero, the lead character of the story, is the one that achieves the resolution by the end. So they are the lens through which these series of cultural archetypes are encountered and dealt with. She flags up an idea that she develops, that when Christianity came into the picture, there was a movement towards individual salvation. So in, for example, Greek stories and Egyptian stories and so on, the ancient myths, there's a lot of collectivism. You still get some of that in biblical stories, but maybe a heavier focus on collectivism. So some king annoys Poseidon, and Poseidon comes out of the ocean and washes away the entire city and everybody in it, just because of one stupid king and what they've done. So that's that kind of collective punishment, but equally Athena giving the people of Athens the olive tree, a collective reward that benefits everybody. So collective rewards, collective punishments. So there is a big focus on the collective, not so much on the fate of individuals, but on the fate of nations, the fate of groups. And she's suggesting Christianity shifts the focus over to individual salvation, my soul going to heaven. And this idea that everybody has souls. So see, there's a big trend in the very early Christian missionaries, before they got a bit politicised, to preach to slaves, to preach to women, to groups of the desperately poor, to groups of people who weren't given much status or value in the societies in which they lived. Later on, the missionaries started targeting their preaching towards the kings and the chieftains and so on, and doing a top-down approach. But very early on, it started as a bottom-up approach of addressing the needs of people who were normally not seen as important enough to have needs thought about or considered. And that is kind of, again, reflective of once Christianity stabilises out and stops this obsession with the rich and powerful and starts to kind of filter out over wider society, that, again, the salvation of every individual, no matter rich, poor, educated, uneducated, top of the shop, bottom of the shop, wherever they fall in society, they have a soul, and that soul is something that interests Jesus, and he wants to save it. He's not only focusing on the rich and the powerful. So that this heavy focus on individualism, she says, creates a bit of a cultural imbalance in those societies in which Christianity has become the dominant religion. And the fairy tales act as a counterbalance. Again, the yin-yang need too much of one thing, you have balance from the other. An antiodromia, as Jung refers to it as being. So the fairy tale, again, brings back the kind of collective rather than the focus on the individual. So even though a lot of fairy tales are told about one lad, one woman, Jack or Vasilisa or whoever it happens to be in the particular story, she says they're just a kind of a lens. It's not, the story isn't really about them. It's about the community. It's about the collective. It's about the group rather than the individual. And the two serve as a sort of a balancing out between very individualistic Christianity and this more collective focus within the fairy tale, which is something we can perhaps reflect on and talk about to some extent, at any rate, in the meeting at the end of the month. She wrote a book on the nature of the shadow, of the dark side of the human psyche, in which she argues quite a number of things. One element which I thought was quite fascinating is where she argues, and we'll go over this more in the March meeting, because this is a theme I'd like to develop there, that typically, of course, upstanding moral people, the sort of Dr. Jekyll types, have all of the brutal, lascivious, raging, angry, dark impulses pushed down into their shadow side, into Mr. Hyde, in Jekyll's case, so that the public face is the good face and the hidden face is the brutal, vicious, savage face, which is kind of standard Jungian understanding of the nature of the shadow. Von Franz suggests that some people present to the world a very brutal face. They're mafia barons and drug lords and really violent, scary, frightening, dangerous people who stomp around the place, and everyone thinks they're pretty bloody grim. So their conscious side is all of the brutal darkness. So by default, she suggests their shadow side will actually be compassion, kindness, decency, honesty, all of the nice values that most of us hope to cultivate in daily life. in those warped, disturbed people, that is what has become their shadow side. So they have contempt for the compassionate, contempt for the weak, contempt for the those who have warm feelings for others. And I'm sort of thinking of a variety of books I've read and films I've seen, TV shows and things, where the one that comes most recently to mind was an old episode of Doctor Who, where the Doctor is doing battle against the Cybermen, who are mostly machines with a brain in the middle of them, but mostly machines. And the cyber leader, the boss of the Cyberman gang, is mocking the Doctor because he threatens to kill the Doctor's companion if the Doctor doesn't comply, and it's sort of your compassion, your friendship, your love is your weakness. It's your frailty, and look how I'm going to crush you, and make you do what I want you to do, which of course always backfires because the Doctor comes to the good at the end. So that I think would be an illustration of what von Franz is talking about, but in a real life situation where somebody sunk into the depths of depravity on a daily basis and the depths of brutality on a daily basis would have decency as their shadow side. And I think that's quite an interesting idea, that sometimes the shadow, ironically, is the lightest part of some people. And the bit that's shown in broad daylight is the grimmest, darkest, most brutal part of them. Which would be an interesting thing to try and put to the test in a prison setting, or especially a high security prison, although it might not last long if you try to put that one to the test. But it's an intriguing idea that the dark, it's probably not even very helpful to talk in terms of dark and light when we're getting into these reversed polarities. But the public face and the hidden face are, for some people, almost diametrically opposed to what is public and what is hidden with other people, with the majority of people, perhaps. So it's kind of an exploration of that. Speaking of the shadow side, one of the things she writes a lot about in context of the shadow picks up on Jung's idea of the 4 levels of functioning. So when you've got your thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition personality types, one of them will be dominant, which he usually refers to and his followers refer to as the superior function, the most developed one of the 4 functions. Then you've got 2 other functions that are sort of in the middle, kind of a little bit developed, but not very much. And at the bottom you have the least developed, the inferior function, the one the person is most uncomfortable with, and it's always the diametric opposite of the superior function, for both von Franz and for Jung himself. So she writes a lot about that and suggests the shadow is almost entirely composed of this inferior function, at least the personal shadow rather than the collective shadow. The collective shadow deals with cultural traumas and things from history that have never been quite addressed or quite dealt with at a collective level. There's also room for personal trauma in the personal shadow, but mainly it's this least developed function. And for her, salvation, if we can use that term, becoming healed, becoming whole again, becoming balanced, is almost entirely reliant on developing the inferior function. So the hero or heroine has to go into the dark. They have to go into their shadow, into their hidden side, and confront those qualities, those skills, those traits, those understandings of the world that they are least comfortable with, and build them up, make them stronger, because whatever one they're most comfortable with won't help. So if you are primarily a thinker, then thinking is not going to get you out of the situations and the nightmare problems you're lumped in. The only thing that will get you out of those situations is feeling, which is the least developed. If you are an intuitive, then intuition won't get you out of the situation. You've got to develop your sensation traits, which again are the least developed for the intuitive person. So it's always the opposite. It's always the polar quality on the other side that needs to be developed, regressed, made better, made more functional in order to achieve harmony, in order to achieve healing and balance. So that's one way of understanding the shadow in terms of inferiority and why it ends up inferior in the first place. Another aspect of the shadow, she says, is undeveloped talent, and it's kind of a similar argument from a slightly different direction. So if someone has abilities, they have gifts, they could be a great writer, a great singer, or well, not even great, just reasonable. A reasonable writer, a reasonable singer, a reasonable healer, a reasonable inventor, whatever it is, and they don't do anything with it. In one of her books, she talks about it being a result of laziness. They just can't be asked to develop, but it could be for other reasons, of course. They might come from a family that lacks the resources to develop those skills at a young age, or which so devalues those skills they see no point in the child developing the abilities and sort of knock 7 shades out of them if they even start. So there could be all kinds of reasons why a person doesn't develop their talents, but her argument is that if they are not developed, they're just kind of left in the corner, in the shadows, they will warp and become poisonous, become destructive. They'll become, to use that tedious and overlaboured term of the 21st century, toxic, because they have not been made use of. They are gifts that are given by, well, whether you believe given by the gods or you think given by genetics or given by whatever you think it's given by. They are gifts that are there to be used, and the longer they go unused, the more damaging they become. They turn to dark outcomes and cause destruction in the life of the person, and inevitably they'll harm other people in the process, because whenever we harm ourselves, we harm others at the same time. So again, the solution to this is to start making good use of those talents, to start developing the things that have not previously been developed, to bring them to the fore, to make more of them. It doesn't mean someone's got to become, the most famous opera singer in the world or the most successful author in the world or whatever. They can be developed in a very modest way, but developed nonetheless. Otherwise, harm will set in. So as a therapeutic technique, being creative is important, but specifically creative in the things you're not very good at, or you don't think you're very good at any rate. You've been told aren't worth being creative in. The neglected skills. It's not sufficient to be creative in the things you're very good at and you're very confident in and you make the most of, because that doesn't need any more developing. It's a done deal. It is the underdeveloped that needs the attention, that needs bringing to the fore. Knowing we've got a few counsellors within the Jungian Circle, I thought it was worth chucking in her mention of the idea, see what you think of it from a professional point of view, that those engaged in counselling or therapy or similar sorts of practices, and maybe we could say broadly healers in general, need to focus on their own healing, more so than the healing of their clientele. And she kind of argues that if the healer heals themselves, they will de facto help and improve others and be of benefit to others in healing other people. So it's not a purely internalised process. It's one that can be offered out to others, and it has that kind of knock-on benefit. So a healer who is screwed up and gives a lot of time and attention and energy to their clientele isn't really, from her point of view, helping them. They should put that time and energy into themselves first. They will become better people, better able to reflect back to their clients, and therefore of more help in the long run. Let's see what people think about that one as an idea. Quite a few of our members are pagan. It's not compulsory. If you're not a pagan and you're thinking about joining the group, it's open to people of all religions and none. But one element of von Franz's argument I thought might appeal quite well to pagans is this idea that internal reality, the unconscious mind, both the individual unconsciousness and the collective unconsciousness, are real. they're not airy-fairy, dreamt-up states. They are as real, she says, as the external world. They may lack the solidity of physical objects you can knock, but they are the dream state world is a reality. Your mind occupies it, your psyche, your soul occupies it, as does everybody else's, and it acquires a solidity, it acquires a reality, a weight. That means it has to be taken seriously and not just treated as a bit of overactive imagination. It is a quite real thing, and I thought that fits in with a lot of esoteric ideas about the nature of the astral plane, the ether, that there are these dream states, these other dimensions of reality, which are real. They're not just imagination, they are actual places, populated by actual beings. So I thought that one might be worth picking up on as a kind of concept, as a notion to explore. Another of her ideas is around the pure eternus, or puella eterna, which is the feminine version, but same basic idea, the inner child. So the eternal boy or the eternal girl, which can become an archetype that overwhelms. Jung uses the term inflation when an archetype becomes too dominant in the mind of an individual, and it sort of drives out all other variety and variation, and that they kind of become a one-trick pony dominated by that archetype. So when that happens, you've got a 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever year old person who is trapped in the mind state. Their body's aging, but their mind is trapped in this childlike state, or adolescent state perhaps. So they are the eternal Peter Pan, or the eternal Tinkerbell, whatever the female version of Peter Pan would be. That they never grow up, and what that does to the individual and traps them. And she talks about this being connected to a fear of the mother, and being kind of tied to the mother's apron strings, the archetypal mother, in the mind within. So the eternal child and the great mother archetype are kind of interrelated. They go hand in glove and shape people. And to be trapped in that state is rather a negative thing, because you don't really go anywhere. There's an American comedy show, I've never seen it, but I have heard about it, called Arrested Development. And that's pretty much what she's talking about with somebody trapped in this eternal child state. Their development is arrested. They never mature, they never really do anything. Every day is a kind of school holiday of playing and mucking about and dossing and not committing, not engaging, not facing up to the somewhat quotidian reality of life, which is all a bit dull and dreary at times. And the solution, she says, or at least the kind of first stage practical step towards a solution, is, unfortunately, I'm afraid, hard work. A touch of the Puritans there, because she feels the eternal child is running away from commitment. They're running away from work. They're running away from the kind of daily reality of adult life. You get up, you go to work, you do your job, no matter how boring it is at times. You come home, you pay the bills, you walk the dog, you prepare dinner, you do this, you do that, and repeat the day after and the day after and the day after and the day after. Adult life can become all a bit routine, let's face it, and a bit monotonous and a bit uninspiring. You do need the balance, of course, between the, let's say, the eternal adult, if I can put it like that, and the eternal child. Someone who is stuck constantly in adult mode will ultimately shrivel up and die of boredom, because they never have any play, any lightness, any frivolity in their heart. But equally, the person stuck in the eternal child mode will fritter away their existence on nonsense and never do anything committed and meaningful, either in terms of career or relationships or personal development or anything else. It's all just surface level nonsense. So the one becomes an antidote for the other. So how you convince somebody stuck in that frame of mind just to get a job and get on with it, I don't know. But she's arguing that is the key. Is just to knuckle down and deal with the day-to-day realities of life. Do your ironing, pay your bills, get a job, get off your backside, make a commitment. Stop titting around and expecting to be looked after by mum or by dad. Get on with it. An interesting element, going a bit out of sync here, aren't I? Having already talked about the shadow side and moved on to other things now, coming back to it. One of the things she does say, which is noticeably different from Jung and quite a few other Jungians, is this proposal that some parts of the shadow side can be so destructive, so violent, so harmful, that they never can be integrated. There was a dispute in early Christianity, which still kind of bubbles up every now and then. On the one side, you had people like Origen arguing that even the devil would one day be redeemed. At the end of time, squillions of years in the future, that even the devil would be redeemed because God's love, etc., is powerful enough to redeem absolutely everybody. So think of the most awful people you can: Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, whoever else. People with millions and millions and millions of deaths on their hand, and torture and sexual abuse and Lord knows what else. Even they would be redeemed eventually. Others, and it became a bit more part of Vatican doctrine that the other view held sway, suggested that once a person is, and that includes the supernatural persons like the devil as well as ordinary flesh and blood persons, once somebody is consigned to hell, it's a one-way street. You go there, you stay there, you don't come back again. So there will not be a redemption for the devil or for Hitler or for any of the other people currently roasting in the fiery pit. That there is no redemption for them. And kind of, I think, that theology is influencing von Franz when she says that some bits of the psyche are so coruscatingly bad that they cannot be integrated, because there is this view in Jung himself that the shadow must be redeemed, it must be integrated, a person must become whole, they've got to come to terms with their shadow and see that the scary dragon is guarding the golden treasures of the psyche, and that maybe the things that they have been told throughout their life are terrible and awful and dreadful and shameful are in fact not irredeemably shameful, they're not irredeemably bad. There are uses and positives to it all, and it can be kind of integrated and so on. But she's saying maybe 95% of it can, but there is the possibility of that 5% that cannot. And she might well have been thinking of her own life. She might have been thinking of patients she'd dealt with over the years, clients, people who had been through things or maybe themselves done things that were so horrific that the impulses that led to that behaviour happening in the first place were beyond integration, were beyond redemption. We could think of really revolting cases like Jimmy Savile. If you've got somebody who is that much of a prolific pervert, abusing and molesting and doing Lord knows what to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids, that horrendous shadow, could that ever be redeemed? And obviously he's dead, so it's a moot point. But there are people like him still alive and breathing. Could their shadow sides be redeemed and integrated? Could they become healed people? Whether you'd ever trust them to reintegrate into society or not, I suppose, is a somewhat separate point. Even if they did heal, you might prefer them to live on an island, just in case. But if you're a prison therapist and you're working with someone who's done just unspeakably vile things, they've raped and tortured and murdered and cannibalised and done Lord knows what else, are they beyond healing? Are they beyond redemption? Are they beyond integrating that monstrous side of them? There may be some bits of them that can be healed, some bits of them that can be reintegrated, but those impulses, the ones that led them into the darkest of places to start with, to the most horrible of acts to start with, is that beyond salvation, beyond healing? And von Franz is suggesting yes. Be interesting to see the views of people in the group, or indeed anyone who's listening to this who wants to post their two pennyth worth underneath as to what they think. Are some people beyond the pale in terms of what can be done about them? I suspect so. Okay, I think that's covered all the main points I wanted to flag up about von Franz's ideas. And clearly she's got loads and loads and loads and loads of other ideas out there. A lifetime of writing books. She lived into her 80s, so she was quite prolific over the course of her lifetime. And we can, as I said earlier, touch on other ideas aside from the ones I've just mentioned in this video. It's just a starting point to get conversation going rather than a limitation as to what can be explored and dealt with. So I'll leave it there, and if you are listening to this and you would like the link to the Teams meeting at the end of the month, do shout and I will send it across to you. Although it's called the Suffolk Jungian Group, we do have people who don't live in Suffolk. They visit Suffolk, they don't live in it. So it's geographically open to people over a wider area if you would like to take part.